I'm going to talk about transformation in a changing climate, bringing in the insights from this IPBES Transformative Change Assessment, but also then like, what does it mean in practice? How do we take this one step further? And as Ella mentioned, the questions that really like drive my research, I've been working on climate change research for about 35 years, and it became very clear that this is a transformative process, and that we're going to be transformed by climate change, or we will transform to avoid climate change or avoid the worst. So the questions that drive my research are, how do we transform at the rate, the scale, the speed, and the depth that is called for to successfully respond to climate change and other crises, including biodiversity loss? And how do we do this in an ethical, equitable, and sustainable manner? And that brings us then to this important question of, what is that relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change? Because I think many of us feel that like what we do doesn't actually matter in terms of large scale systems change. But again, the seriousness and the urgency of change, that we are actually being transformed. And when we read the papers these days, we see that change is happening fast, and we're seeing environmental catastrophes around the world, all over the world. And we know that the impacts of climate change are not equally distributed around the world. In fact, it's very much an issue of equity and justice. And we see injustices all over the world because the people who have contributed least to climate change are experiencing the most significant impacts. And we also see that, it took us decades to get to a voluntary agreement in the Paris Climate Agreement and we're aiming to limit warming to 1.5 ideally above pre-industrial levels, and we're failing on that. So this is really like the urgency. And again, it's not just climate change, it's also biodiversity. And we see that the global assessment in 2019 showed that without action, we run the risk of losing 1 million species. So loss is a big part of this. And then finally, we know that these are systemic changes, and we're on the verge of 5 catastrophic climate tipping points. So, the crisis really is real. It's a poly-crisis, a multi-crisis, like a huge crisis. And I think for many of us, when we hear about this, we can get very, despondent and despaired and just go like, what do we do? And many people are, really thinking of these disaster movies, The Day After Tomorrow, Where Will You Be? And we see this playing out in front of us, but we really need to change the script, to change the narrative and come up with a different movie. And I think this is really that we are in the decade that matters. And this really, we have to turn this into a story of transformation. So what are we going to do? How will we be? How will we show up? And so for me, transformations really is a word that can kind of get us into this idea of like, how do we, create these physical and or qualitative changes in form, structure, and meaning making all together. And this is very much exemplified by the caterpillar that goes in through a metamorphosis into a butterfly. It changes its form, it changes its structure, and it also changes its meaning making, because the butterfly sees a very different world than the caterpillar. So this is very much, like this, what is transformative change? Well, it has these different dimensions, but there's something much deeper related to transformative change as well. And this, as one of my collaborators, Monica Sharma, talked about, it's the powerful unleashing of human potential to commit, care, and affect change for a better life. So it's something in us that we say, we know we can do better than this. And that, I think, is what we're seeing around the world now, is that we're in such a multiple crises that we actually have to think, like, how do we transform? So I was, of course, thrilled when the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services was asked by governments to do an assessment of transformative change. And the assessment has a very long title. It's called The Underlying Causes of Biodiversity Loss and Determinants of Transformative Change and Options for Achieving the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity. We call it the Transformative Change Assessment for short. And in the summary for policymakers that was recently approved, we have 3 sections. And the first one emphasizes that transformative change is urgent, necessary, and challenging, but possible. And the but possible is the really important part of this, because we show that this is happening and how it can happen. And we provide in the second section strategies and actions for transformative change, because it's not just going to happen out of hope. We actually need to think about how do we work strategically to overcome all the barriers. And finally, we talk about that there are roles for all in enabling transformative change. And this is really important because it's not just for governments, it's not just for civil society, it's not just for businesses, it's for everybody. And so in the assessment, we defined deliberate transformative change for a just and sustainable world, recognizing that transformative changes of all sorts are happening. We're saying that these type of changes shift views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. So we're really looking at specific changes and saying that if we want to achieve the 2050 vision for biodiversity, if we want to address all the direct drivers of nature's decline, including climate change, including pollution, and including land use and sea use changes, that we have to address the underlying causes. And this really means that we have to dig deep, because the underlying causes are these deeply rooted and interconnected social and cultural patterns. They're the patterns that shape, influence, and reinforce all of the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So we're saying we need to go deep. And the ones that were identified in the assessment of the literature, there were three key underlying causes, and these were disconnection from and domination over nature and people, the concentration of power and wealth, and finally, the prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. And these three together, they work to actually influence all the indirect drivers, whether they're economic and technological or demographic and sociocultural or conflicts and epidemics, and et cetera, and the direct drivers. And this figure is adapted from the global assessment. And what we're really saying is that we have to go under, get to those root causes of these. And how do we do that? If transformative change has to address the underlying causes, we need to have some sort of principles and practices that can actually achieve those. And so our assessment identified 4 key principles of transformative change. And the first of these key principles was equity and justice. In other words, we need to do transformative change in a way that all people can benefit. We can't have a world that works for some but not the others. And this also then ties into pluralism and inclusion. Who's going to decide how to change? Change, it has to be co-created. It has to actually be a process where people are involved and have a voice in it. And the third, and very importantly, is respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships. And this is something that we know from indigenous and local communities around the world that have been practicing these. That if we treat nature as if it's just something to exploit and use and abuse, we will not actually have the transformative changes that we need. And finally, in a more process-based principle, adaptive learning and action is necessary, because there's always going to be unexpected consequences and surprises, and we may be thinking we're on a path towards transformative change, but we may have to redirect and reconsider. And this is, we live in a dynamic and complex world, so we have to be very adaptive to this. And this brings us then to what do we know and how do we do it? And we've assessed many different, more than 60 different frameworks and theories and subdisciplines and approaches. And we know that no single approach gives us the answer. We have to weave together insights from diverse approaches and knowledge systems, which includes indigenous and local knowledges, because that is what will enhance our strategies and action. So we know, of course, that we have systems approaches and structural approaches. We know we have science and technology approaches, but we also know we have approaches to knowledge co-creation, to empowerment, and also to inner transformation. So how do we weave these together? And often, in the work that we're doing in our everyday, we have to ask, what's missing? What are we not seeing in our approach? And I think that's where we start to see that there's a lot to be added, especially through collaboration. And this gets us then to who are the actors, who are the ones that are going to be taking this into account and making it happen. And we know that transformative change is system-wide. And so to achieve it, it requires a whole of society and a whole of government approach that engages all sectors and actors envisioning and contributing collaboratively. So in the assessment, we identify 5 different strategies and actions. We identify a lot of the challenges to transformative change. And I'm not going to go through all the details here because, yeah, certainly you can read it. But the idea here is that we need to pull together, like protecting the areas that we have. We need to address the sectors that are most responsible for these things. We also need to change our economic and financial systems. We need to change our governance systems to be more inclusive. And then we need to change our relationship to nature, our societal, collective societal views and values in terms of how we protect nature. So this really is, there's roles for governments, there's roles for businesses, there are roles for civil society, and we've come up with all those. But again, to align our actions and strategies, we need to have shared positive visions, and the way we develop them is especially important. Recognizing our socio-ecological interdependencies, the agency of non-human life forms, and also an ethics of care. And this is really important, as I'll talk about later. Like, where are we drawing the line between us and others? How do we actually think of ourselves in terms of future generations, et cetera? So the visions, which are really the narratives and the stories that describe the future states of people and nature, including Mother Earth, are very much shaped by the values and worldviews that define the goals and intentions. And I'm going to go through this a little bit more in detail, but really, like, both small scale and large scale changes are contributing to transformative change. And this was something that came out of our assessment because we included, the assessment included about like 391 case studies from around the world, and we analyzed them, and we saw that a lot of the changes that were happening were taking place in less than a decade, and they were contributing. There were these small scale changes, but they were actually having a wider impact. So whereas people say, oh, incremental change doesn't matter, these are just small trivial changes, all changes, all increments that address the underlying causes are moving us along a different pathway. And that, I think, is really important because, we sometimes underestimate what small changes can do. And when they address the underlying causes, they can be very powerful. So just some of the take-home messages and the insights that, come out of this assessment is that, we have to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, and which it leads to the challenges and barriers to transformative change. It involves principles, strategies, and actions, and it results from both small-scale and large-scale changes and includes roles for everyone in enabling transformative change. So the framework we have really is, like, how do we break through these underlying causes that are affecting the views, structures, and practices that we're seeing today? And by views, we mean, like, the ways of seeing and thinking and knowing, and the structures are the way of organizing, government, and governing and regulating, and the practices are the ways of, like, doing, behaving, and relating. And so all of these things right now today are very much influenced by these underlying causes. And in many parts of the world today, we're seeing that these are actually being strengthened, especially the concentration of power and wealth and the prioritization of short-term gain. So how do we break away from this? How do we actually move from those to the principles of transformative change? And these principles, this is where we want to be, where equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and adaptive learning and action are actually inspiring the changes in the views, structures, and practices. And then this brings me to the work that I've been doing, because it's like, okay, well, how do we do this in practice? We can say this is, and this is where over the last years I've been working together with Dr. Monica Sharma, who headed the UN's leadership in capacity development for a number of years. And her job was to scale change. And she was working with the HIV/AIDS pandemic and women's health around the world. And her conscious full spectrum response appealed to me because it was on, like, personal to planetary transformations. So I contacted her and I said, I have a problem called climate change, and I'd love to work with you. And so working on my colleague, Linda Signa, and I developed from her work these three spheres of transformation, which really are the practical, the political, and the personal, recognizing that similar to views, structures, and practices, that these are actually all necessary and important. They're not separate from each other. And if we want outcomes for sustainability, if we want to achieve our climate goals, we actually have to take all of them seriously. So I'm going to walk you through these and just to, to talk about that, because really it is about, changes in form, structure, and meaning making in every sense of the word. And the practical sphere is in the center. It's really like I think of it as like the bullseye, and it is the behaviors and the technical responses. It's what we can measure. It's the 169 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the solar panels on houses. It's the bicycles in the streets. It's the plant-based options on menus. It's education of girls. It's all of these things that that we're really striving to achieve, and we've been striving for them to achieve them for decades. And so they're central, literally central to transformative change. But as you probably all recognize, that we're actually not bending the curves on greenhouse gas emissions. We are not achieving any of the Aichi targets for biodiversity loss. We are failing to actually create these, reach these practical changes that we want, the measurable results. So why is that? Well, it's the political sphere. We're often ignoring the systems and the structures that are actually influencing what we can do in the practical sphere. And these are just, these are the social and cultural norms, the rules, the regulations, the incentives. They're really about how we organize society. So it's political with a capital P, because it really is it is about our collective action. And this is really, it's where power and politics become involved, because some people see that, have different desires for the practical sphere. And it's where we end up in a state of polarization and paralysis, which many of us are feeling and experiencing today. And it's also where you get resistance, where you get social movements, where you get people organizing and saying, wait, we can have a degrowth economy, we can have a gift economy, we can do things differently and get different outcomes in the practical sphere. So it's a really important sphere, and it's as we see all over the world today, it's also very it's like we can get stuck there. And this is where we've gotten stuck waiting, decades for a voluntary agreement on climate change. And now we see that in the political sphere, we can go back several decades in terms of environmental policies and practices. So what is going on there? And this is where we need to pay attention to the personal sphere. And the personal sphere is these, individual and shared or collective beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. The subjective world that we share in our heads that influence how we see the systems, how we see ourselves in relation to the systems. Am I a leader? Do I actually influence the things in the political sphere? And also, what kind of goals do we have for the practical sphere? Because if we see, if we're aiming for the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 agenda, if we're aiming for the 2050 vision for biodiversity loss, and at the same time we're aiming for perpetual economic growth at any cost, then we start to see that collision, especially in the political sphere. So the personal sphere is, it influences all the other spheres. And often when I talk about the personal sphere, people will nod and go, yes, 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 we need to change people's behaviors, people's beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms, so that they all get very green and environmental. But if any of you have ever tried to change someone, putting them into the practical sphere and making them as objects to be changed never works. You often get pushback, resistance, and, counteracting any efforts. Instead, what we're talking about is really kind of unleashing that potential in people to make them the subjects of change rather than the objects of change. And when we think about these different spheres acting together, in reality, we often have, some people working very practically on the technical responses, some people working in the political and practical spheres in social practice theory or science policy interfaces, et cetera, and some working in the personal sphere on the inner development goals or, things. But we really need to get away from a fragmented approach, away from partial and siloed approaches towards outcomes for sustainability that cross across, cut across all of them. So this is, I think, our challenge then is to actually take them all together. And if you've heard of the leverage points for systems change, Donella Meadows' seminal paper in 1999 on places to intervene in systems, which has had a very, it's gotten a lot of attention in recent years because we want to be working at high leverage points. And I think that the three spheres kind of maps onto these nicely in terms of like the practical sphere is a lot about like the constants, parameters, the numbers, those really measurable things that we can, like we can really work on. But often they don't have that much leverage because you get, the more energy efficient something becomes, the cheaper it becomes, and the more we fly or buy or whatever. And that's why the political sphere is so important because it is it's the stocks and the flows, the rates of change, the feedback loops, the information flows, and not the least, the rules of the system and the power to influence the system and the structures. And we see that in a very short period of time right now, for example, in the United States, that the power to change the system has changed everything, down the line, the feedback loops, the stocks, the flows, everything. So it's having an enormous impact. And that brings us then to the higher leverage points of the power to influence. Above those is the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm from which the system arises, and finally the power to transcend paradigms. And for me, that is really important. That I think that we should be working at these high leverage points for systems change. And this is so I'm going to walk you through especially the personal sphere here, because I think that often does not get enough attention. And often when it does get attention, we talk about changing other people's beliefs and values and worldviews rather than actually thinking about like, okay, how do we look at, reflect on our own and in relation to others? How do we show up differently in the political sphere? How do we engage with people who do not share our worldview? How do we find that point of connection so that we can reach our, common desired goals and what we value and care about? So the beliefs, I'll start with beliefs because, there's a lot of talk about like, do you believe in climate change or do you not believe in climate change? And, the belief is an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially one without proof. And I would say that in terms of climate change, it's like, how do you understand the climate system and our relationship to it? And but beliefs, there are many beliefs that influence our beliefs about climate change. And Niels Nielsen writes that our beliefs play important roles in perceiving a current situation, in identifying appropriate actions, and in predicting the effects of those actions. So, in other words, our beliefs really are, like influencing what we see, whether we see, whether we believe what we see or do we see what we believe, and there's an important difference here. Just as an example. Some years ago, I think it was about 2017, I was teaching a PhD course, and this came out in The Guardian, and it said the planet has just 5% chance of reaching the Paris climate goal because of economic emissions and population trends. So very, very small chance that we would reach this by the end of the century. And it was about a 1% chance of reaching the 1.5 degree goal. And so if if you just believe that this article is true and start planning, for the future, you probably would put more attention on adaptation than on mitigation. You say like, okay, well, we're not going to do this. But if you actually go and you read the article that the Guardian is talking about, it's about an integrated assessment model. And at the very end, where they talk about their assumptions in the models or what they're believing is important, they say our forecasting model does not explicitly incorporate future legislation that could change future emissions. It's based on past emissions. We have not accounted for the possibility that decreasing prices for alternative energy could cause a sudden massive shift to alternative energy, because that would be speculative. And here, this was in 2017. This was before Fridays for the Future. This was, there's a lot of things about cultural change that are not included in these models. There's a lot about political change that is not included in these models. It's really extrapolating the trends into the future. So I just want to think, like when we have these kind of things of like, and this is, going back to the 1.5, and now people are saying, well, it's now we can limit climate change to 2 degrees or to 2.5 or whatever. And we have these beliefs popping up in our head, based on, everything we know. We could say, oh, it's already too late. And, I might say that if we had started in 1988, when James Hansen declared that climate change was real and a problem, we wouldn't be here. This wouldn't be a problem now. Or we might say that, oh, people will never change. And, our sample size might be people we know, or politicians or something like that, but we can just be very much like, oh, no one ever changes. And yeah, and you can challenge that too. There might be other beliefs, like the payoff for renewables will never exceed that for fossil fuels, and without actually looking at some of the data that is showing that they're, like the costs are are lowering really rapidly. We could say that the models say it's impossible and the models are always right, no matter what, or that it's all just natural variability, like the sunspots or solar flares or whatever. Others might say, well, I believe that, we don't have to do anything because we can adapt to all types of changes. And sometimes we get that in Norway that, like, oh, a few degrees warmer won't make any difference, which we know that it will make an enormous difference. And then there's the belief that, of course, we can. In fact, we can reverse global warming. And this is Paul Hawken's drawdown approach. This is people who are saying, like, we have never tried everything beyond just greenhouse gas mitigations. We've never addressed this as addressing land use change, biodiversity, climate change, equity and justice, all of these things in one. And that if we look at the hundreds of solutions that we have, then we could actually do this much faster. So these are just to show that, our beliefs make a difference, but so do our values. And our values are always influenced by motivations. And this is from Shalom Schwartz's value circumplex, which is quite well known in the values literature. But he talks about, like, conservation and openness to change as being motivations, or self-enhancement and self-transcendence as being motivators for different types of values. And there are so many different types of values, and we prioritize them in different contexts. But what we're really seeing is that in the political sphere, we see a lot of value conflicts. So, and the ones that are across from each other, like openness to change and conservation, often create the conflicts, or self-transcendence and self-enhancement. So really it is like about, what do we care about deeply? And then how do we, how does that relate to what other people care about deeply? And so I want to, just emphasize how important the values that apply to all are. And that goes back to the principles from the Transformative Change Assessment of equity and justice and pluralism and inclusion and respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, and then, of course, the adaptive learning. So our beliefs and our values are very much linked to our views of the world. And I'm not going to go through all these things, but our view of the world isn't just like a static one view. It's actually like a conglomeration, or like the confluence of our ideas of self, like, who am I? Like, how do I identify? And our cognition, what am I aware of? What am I not aware of? Our values, and as I just mentioned, what is significant to me, our morals, and what should I do? Our interpersonal relationships is like, how should we interact together? How do we organize ourselves? And needs, in terms of what is important for us, what are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example. And then there's the emotional dimensions. How do we feel? The aesthetic dimensions, what's attractive? And then again, the relational perspective. Where am I drawing the line between us and other, and humans and nature? And then finally, spiritual. What is of ultimate concern? And all of these then give us a vantage point of the world, a perspective on the world that we take. And it's not just one perspective. We can move around in our lifetimes and change our worldviews. And it's not to say that one, being at the peak of the mountain, you might not see the richness of the soil under the trees or whatever. But the idea here is that we're all looking at the world through our lenses, through our filters, and we all have our blind spots. And so that goes into, Donella Meadows' highest leverage point, that, being able to transcend our paradigms is being able to see that we are actually in a paradigm. And so Meadows talked about paradigms as the sources of systems, and from shared social agreements about the nature of reality, come systems goals and information flows, feedbacks, stock flows, and everything else about systems. And this, I think, really becomes then let us look at what are our paradigms. And a paradigm can be defined as, like you can see in the pictures, like it's a set of concepts, metaphors, or patterns of thought that underline theories and methods of science, but they also influence the way we organize society. So there is a very close link between our, the way we see the world and the way we organize society. And right now, we've really kind of like drawn a line in the sand between me and you and us and others and society and environment and humans and nature. And this goes back to the, like Newtonian Cartesian view of the world of looking, very much as, as we're like atomistic, deterministic, like very reductionist view of people and nature. And it's very much counter to a lot of the indigenous and local knowledge traditions and wisdom traditions that are saying that, like, wait a minute, we have a relational approach with nature. Nature has an intrinsic value, so do we, and etc. So not just the instrumental. And when we create these lines in the sand, when we make these separate partial ideas, we end up with a very fragmented society, and we end up with very fragmented thinking, and we don't necessarily it makes it very difficult to see the bigger picture. And I think a lot of people are really struggling right now with the fragmentation of society, the fragmentation of our meaning making, and everything. And if you go back to 1980, physicist David Bohm said in his book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, he said, he recognized the danger. He said, what is primarily needed is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. And I think that fragmentary process of thought is part of what is creating the fragmentary world that we're living in right now and accelerating climate change to a very dangerous level or degree. So in my work, I'm very much looking at, what would another paradigm tell us? And so the question I started asking maybe about 12 years ago was that, can insights from quantum physics and quantum social science inspire transformations that are not only rapid and effective, as in a quantum leap, but equitable, ethical, and sustainable? And so this urgency to address it, it very much pushed me outside of my comfort zone. And I was thinking, okay, well, let's look, because we actually need to go beyond the paradigms that are creating the problems. And so I kind of defined quantum social change as a different approach to social change. And it describes a conscious, nonlinear, and non-local approach to transformations that is grounded in our inherent oneness. And this inherent oneness is part of what we're recognizing in the Anthropocene, that we actually influence systems and systems influence us, and that it is not, we're not separate from nature. In fact, we are nature. And this approach recognizes that we are entangled through our language, through meaning, through shared context, and also our deepest values and intentions are the sources of that individual change, collective change, and systems change. So it transcends the scale of, local, global, top down, bottom up. And so in the book, I'm really looking at these relationships and, that in terms of are we thinking of seeing ourselves as, or in our systems as out there, as separate from us, or are we seeing ourselves not just as parts of systems, but as the systems? So we are part of the systems that are changing. And when one part of the system becomes conscious that it is changing the system, then the whole system changes. So that is the good news there. But I also recognize that it's the language we speak that is important. And metaphors, as linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson said, they said that new metaphors have the power to create a new reality, because when we start to make sense of our everyday experiences through a new metaphor and act in accordance with that, then everything starts to, we start to experience the world differently. So the language that we're using is important. And in climate change, we tend to have very binary separating language, like cost benefits, impacted, non-impacted, etc. So this is something to be aware of, just that our metaphors are important. And one language that we can talk about is entanglement. And this is not just a metaphor, but this is the nature of reality, in every sense of the world, because it's a non-local relationship that applies to the subatomic level, but we also see it in, people are saying that in language, in experience, etc. It's actually, there is no difference in that entanglement. So what we're talking about is not causal, but correlated or co-related. And so when we have shared meaning making, we actually have this entanglement of language and meaning, which is coming up. And so this brings me then to this idea then of like, well, what do we do and how do we act now? And obviously agency matters, consciousness matters, and our way of showing up and being in the world. And I think it shows us that this idea of fractals matter. And fractals are self-similar patterns that reproduce cross scales in mathematics, like in algebra and geometry. They can be reproducing infinitely, across these things. You can look on the internet and see amazing fractals, and like Mandelbrot's set and the Sierpinski triangle, which we see here. But fractals are also visible in nature in patterns that repeat themselves, not infinitely, but we see them in tree branches, in hives, in the structure of leaves, in rivers and coastlines, etc. And what I'm interested in, many are interested in, is what are social fractals? Because social fractals are patterns that repeat themselves regardless of what scale we are talking about. And this is really, social fractals aren't neutral. They are based on values. So when every action is based on equity and justice and pluralism and inclusion and respectful and reciprocal human nature relationships, you start to get some consistency and coherence regardless of the social context or the location or scale of it. And I think this is really important, that we start to realize that right now we're seeing a lot of fragmented patterns in the world and just like everything being disrupted, but we're also seeing a lot of communities that are creating these fractals. And some of the case studies from the Transformative Change Assessment really show this beautifully, where communities are based on coexistence and dignity and equity and caring, compassion and caring. And so when we start to think about putting together the practical, the political, and the personal spheres together in the same, that we start to recognize that our universal values or the principles of transformative change are our entry points for actually engaging in the political sphere and for producing things in the practical sphere, including the visions and of what we want to achieve. Then we start to think of like what I do here in Oslo and what you're doing in Dublin or wherever in the world you are is very much aligned in the same direction. And it doesn't mean we all have to do these cookie cutter actions that are all the same everywhere. But if we are, no matter what sector no matter what role we play, we actually are contributing to the larger patterns of systems change. And just to illustrate that, that it is that if you think of all of us on this call in a group, or all of us in Ireland or Norway or whatever, and all of us in the world, that we can create these patterns and align. And it doesn't mean that we all have to be doing the same thing, but it's about doing things differently. And that is one of the insights that came out of the Transformative Change Assessment. It's not just like what we do, but it's the direction and quality of change as well. So it's really a very subtle change, but when we start to really dig deeper, addressing the underlying causes through principles, we start to see that we can make much bigger changes than we think. So this is connecting the individual to your family and friends and your personal networks and your communities and villages and neighborhoods and meta communities, urban areas, nation states, all the way up to the continental and global, and all Homo sapiens, etc. So this is really it's a process and a practice, but it does mean that we actually matter a lot. And going back then to the if we think of the Transformative Change Assessment, it's really defining this fractal of change of of how we can do things differently and show up differently and create things differently. It really gives a much more optimistic idea of that changes are happening everywhere around the world. There's so many of them. Often they're off the radar from what we see and read in the news and everything. But the idea here is that what we do right now matters, but you matter too. All of us matter. And if we start to move out from looking at the technologies and the behavioral changes and really start to see people as agents of change, having political agency, having individual agency, having collective agency, then we start to see that people are the most powerful solution to climate change. And this is not just to inspire, but it's actually to get people to that we actually think we actually are a collective. We are like one large organism. And that's the beauty of what is coming out now in these troubled times, is that we're seeing more and more people. And one of my students made this sign for a climate march, and somebody turned it into artwork and said, imagine what we can do if 7.7 billion people truly believe their actions make a difference. So I just want to leave you with that today, in that transformative change is urgent, necessary, and challenging, but possible. And our assessment really shows that everybody has a role to play, and that is really the challenge that we have right now for addressing climate change and nature's decline. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to answering questions.